The first scream pierced the dawn air of Millhaven just as Dmitry Korvanik was pouring his morning coffee. He paused, the ceramic mug halfway to his lips, listening to the sound that seemed to tear through the fabric of their peaceful suburban morning. His wife Esmeralda emerged from their bedroom, her dark hair still tousled from sleep, concern etched across her olive-skinned face. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, instinctively moving toward their daughter Zara's room. The 17-year-old was still asleep, her breathing steady and undisturbed by whatever chaos was beginning to unfold outside their home. 3 houses down, Caspian Thornwick was already at his window, his weathered hands gripping the curtains as he watched their neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, stumbling across her front lawn. Something was terribly wrong with the elderly woman's movements. They were jerky, unnatural, as if she were a marionette controlled by an inexperienced puppeteer. His wife Isolde joined him, their 8-year-old son Orion still fast asleep upstairs, blissfully unaware that their quiet neighborhood was about to become a battleground. "Caspian, her face." Isolde's voice trailed off as they both witnessed something that would haunt their dreams for weeks to come. Mrs. Henderson's features were gray and lifeless, her eyes clouded with a milky film, and when she opened her mouth, a guttural moan escaped that sounded nothing like the sweet woman who had baked them cookies just last weekend. Across the street, in the corner house with the overgrown garden, Thaddeus Valdres was already moving with the efficiency of a man who had seen too much in his 73 years. His daughter Serafina was gathering supplies while his twin grandsons, Lysander and Evander, helped board up the lower windows. At 15, the boys had inherited their grandfather's practical nature and their mother's fierce determination. "Grandfather, what's happening to people?" Lysander asked, his hammer pausing mid-swing as another inhuman cry echoed from somewhere near the town center. Thaddeus's steel-gray eyes surveyed the chaos beginning to spread through their neighborhood. Cars were abandoned in the middle of streets, doors hung open, and the sound of breaking glass punctuated the morning air like a violent symphony. "Something we've never seen before, boy. But we'll survive it, just like we've survived everything else." The old man had lived through wars, natural disasters, and economic collapse, but nothing had prepared him for the sight of his neighbor, young Marcus Webb, pursuing his own wife with the single-minded hunger of a predator. The woman's terrified screams cut through the air before being abruptly silenced, and Thaddeus knew they had perhaps minutes before whatever madness had consumed the town reached their doorstep. It was Dmitry who made the first move toward cooperation. As a former military engineer, he recognized the strategic importance of unity in crisis situations. He watched as the Thornwick family huddled in their living room and noticed the methodical preparations happening at the Valdres house. When a group of the infected, he couldn't bring himself to think of them as people anymore, began shambling down their street, he made a decision that would bind 3 families together in ways they never could have imagined. Grabbing his emergency radio, Dmitry tuned to the community channel they all used during neighborhood watch meetings. "This is Dmitry Korvanik. Is anyone else seeing what I'm seeing? We need to work together if we're going to make it through this." The response was immediate. Caspian's voice crackled through the static. "We're here, Dmitry. Isolde, Orion, and myself. We're trapped in our house with at least 4 of those things in our yard." Then came Thaddeus's gravelly tone, "Valdres family reporting. We're secure for now, but not for long. I suggest we consolidate our position. The old community center has thick walls and multiple exits. If we can reach it, we might have a chance." As if summoned by their conversation, the infected began to notice the occupied houses. The creatures moved with disturbing purpose, their moans growing louder as they detected the warmth and life hidden behind doors and windows. Mrs. Henderson was now joined by others, the mailman, teenagers from the local high school, even families with young children, all transformed into something that was no longer human. Esmeralda clutched Dimitri's arm as they watched their world collapse through their living room window. How do we get to the community center? There must be dozens of them between here and there. The question hung in the air like a challenge, and in that moment, 3 families realized that their survival depended not just on their individual strength, but on their ability to trust strangers who, until this morning, had been nothing more than familiar faces at neighborhood barbecues and school functions. The plan came together with desperate efficiency. Thaddeus's military experience from his youth in Eastern Europe proved invaluable as he outlined a route to the community center that would minimize their exposure to the growing hordes of infected. The building sat on a small hill at the edge of their neighborhood, surrounded by a chain-link fence that could be reinforced and offering clear sight lines in all directions. "We move in 15 minutes, Dimitri announced over the radio, his engineer's mind already calculating load-bearing walls and defensive positions. "Pack only essentials, food, water, medical supplies, and weapons. We won't get a second chance at this." Zara Korvanik had awakened to find her parents frantically stuffing supplies into backpacks, their faces grim with a determination she had never seen before. At 17, she was old enough to understand that their lives had fundamentally changed, but young enough to feel the crushing weight of fear as she watched her neighbors, people she had known since childhood, transformed into mindless predators. "Mom, what about school? What about my friends?" The questions tumbled out before she could stop them, and she immediately felt foolish. Through their bedroom window, she could see smoke rising from the direction of Millhaven High School, and the distant sound of sirens had been replaced by an ominous silence. Esmeralda pulled her daughter close, breathing in the familiar scent of her shampoo while they still could. "Right now, staying alive is the only thing that matters. Everything else, we'll figure out later." The Thornwick family faced their own challenges. Orion had taken the morning's events with the adaptability of childhood, treating the boarding up of windows as an exciting game until he glimpsed one of the infected through a gap in their defenses. The sight of his former Little League coach, Mr. Rodriguez, with blood coating his baseball uniform and his jaw hanging at an unnatural angle, sent the boy into hysterics. Isolde held her son while Caspian made final preparations, checking the ammunition for his hunting rifle and filling water bottles. As a carpenter, he understood the importance of solid construction, and he knew the community center's brick walls and reinforced doors would provide better protection than their suburban home with its large windows and multiple entry points. "Will we ever come back here?" Orion asked between sobs, clutching the stuffed elephant that had been his constant companion since he was 3. Caspian knelt beside his son, choosing honesty over false comfort. "I don't know, buddy. But wherever we go together. That's what families do." At the Valdres house, preparation took on the efficiency of a military operation. Serafina, a nurse at the local clinic, had already filled their medical kit with supplies from her work bag, while Lysander and Evander helped their grandfather select tools that could serve as weapons. The twins moved with synchronized precision, a lifetime of shared experiences allowing them to anticipate each other's actions. "Remember what I taught you about combat," Thaddeus instructed, testing the weight of a crowbar in his weathered hands. "These things aren't human anymore. They don't feel pain, they don't get tired, and they don't stop. Aim for the head, and don't hesitate." Serafina watched her father prepare her sons for violence and felt something break inside her chest. Just yesterday, her biggest worry had been whether the boys would pass their geometry exams. Now she was listening to a 73-year-old man explain to 15-year-old children how to kill. The radio crackled to life. "This is Dimitri. Movement in the street is picking up. We need to go now, before they organize into a larger group." The 3 families emerged from their homes simultaneously, moving with the desperate coordination of people who understood that their survival depended on reaching safety together. The infected had indeed begun to cluster, drawn by the noise and activity of the living, and their moans created a haunting chorus that echoed off the suburban houses. Dimitri led the way, his military training evident in how he moved from cover to cover, signaling the others to follow. Esmeralda and Zara stayed close behind him, while the Thornwick family brought up the middle and the Valdres clan guarded the rear. They moved through backyards and along fence lines, avoiding the main streets where the largest groups of infected had gathered. The community center came into view after 20 minutes of careful movement, its brick facade promising safety and security. But between them and their destination lay the final challenge, an open field with no cover, where they would be exposed and vulnerable for the longest 200 yards of their lives. As they crouched behind the last house before the field, watching infected figures shamble between them and salvation, 3 families who had been strangers that morning prepared to trust their lives to each other. The bonds forged in crisis would prove stronger than blood, and the community center would become more than just a refuge, it would become home. The sprint across the open field became a nightmare of coordination and terror. Dmitri had counted 17 infected between their position and the community center's entrance, but as soon as they broke cover, more emerged from the shadows of nearby buildings, drawn by the sound of running feet and labored breathing. Caspian's hunting rifle spoke first, the sharp crack echoing across the field as one of the infected dropped motionless to the ground. But the gunshot acted like a dinner bell, and suddenly the scattered figures began moving with frightening purpose toward the sound of life and warmth. "Keep moving!" Thaddeus shouted, his voice carrying the authority of command as he brought up the rear. In his hands, a modified walking stick had become a weapon, its steel tip finding the skull of an infected teenager who had once delivered newspapers to his house. Zara stumbled, her foot catching in a gopher hole, and for a terrifying moment she was separated from the group. An infected woman in a nurse's uniform, her name tag still reading Janet, lurched toward the fallen girl with reaching hands that ended in broken, bloody fingernails. Lysander and Evander moved as one, the twins flanking the creature and bringing it down with a coordination that spoke of hours spent practicing together. "Thank you," Zara gasped as they pulled her to her feet, but there was no time for more. The fence surrounding the community center was only 50 yards away, but it might as well have been 50 miles with the growing crowd of infected converging on their position. Isolde carried Orion, the boy's small arms wrapped tightly around his mother's neck as she ran with a desperation that gave her strength she never knew she possessed. Behind them, Serafina used her medical training to guide them toward the safest path, calling out obstacles and threats like a battlefield medic. The fence presented its own challenge. The chain-link barrier was 8 feet high and topped with razor wire, designed to keep vandals out of the community center's property. Under normal circumstances, it would have been impassable for a group carrying supplies and protecting children. But desperation breeds innovation, and Dimitri's engineering background proved invaluable. "Caspian, your tools!" Dmitri called out as the first infected reached the fence behind them. The carpenter's wire cutters made quick work of a section near the gate, creating an opening large enough for them to slip through while the infected pressed against the barrier with increasing intensity. The community center's doors were locked, but Thaddeus had anticipated this problem. His crowbar made short work of the entrance, and within minutes, all 3 families had found themselves in the building's main hall, gasping for breath and listening to the growing sounds of the infected testing the fence's strength outside. "How long will that fence hold?" Esmeralda asked, settling Zara into a chair while examining a cut on her daughter's arm from their desperate flight. Caspian studied the structure through one of the building's high windows, his carpenter's eye assessing its construction. "It's sturdy, but it wasn't designed to hold back a crowd. If enough of them press against it, the posts will give way. We have maybe hours, not days." The reality of their situation began to sink in. They had reached temporary safety, but they were also trapped. The infected continued to gather outside, their numbers growing as more arrived, drawn by the commotion of their escape. Through the windows, the families could see their former neighbors, teachers, and friends, all transformed into something hungry and relentless. Orion sat quietly in his mother's lap, his young mind struggling to process what he had witnessed. "Mommy, why don't they remember us?" he whispered, pointing toward the window where his former piano teacher pressed her face against the glass, leaving bloody streaks with each attempt to reach them. Isolde looked to the other adults, hoping someone had an answer that would make sense to a child. It was Serafina who knelt beside the boy, her nurse's training helping her find words that were honest but not terrifying. "Sometimes people get very sick," she explained gently. "So sick that they forget who they are and who they love. It's not their fault, and it doesn't mean they stopped caring about you. They just can't remember how to show it anymore. As night approached, the three families began to truly understand what they had committed to. The community center would need to be fortified, supplies would need to be rationed, and difficult decisions would need to be made about how long they could realistically hold their position. Dmitri spread architectural plans of the building across a table, pointing out structural weaknesses and potential improvements. We can reinforce the doors and windows, but our biggest problem is going to be food and water. This place wasn't designed for long-term occupation. Outside, the fence groaned under the increasing pressure of bodies pressing against it, and in the darkness beyond, more figures continued to arrive. The families had won their first battle, but the war for survival was just beginning, and each of them understood that the morning had changed them in ways they were only beginning to comprehend. 3 days into their occupation of the community center, the families had established routines that helped maintain a semblance of normalcy amid the chaos outside. The fence had held, though sections bulged ominously where the infected pressed against it with relentless persistence. During the day, the creatures seemed less active, allowing the survivors to move about the building and make necessary improvements to their defenses. Dmitri and Caspian had worked together to reinforce the building's entry points, their different skills complementing each other perfectly. The engineer's understanding of structural integrity combined with the carpenter's practical knowledge of materials and tools created fortifications that were both effective and efficient. They had discovered a shared language in the precision of their work, measuring twice and cutting once, taking on new meaning when mistakes could cost lives. My grandfather built furniture that lasted for generations, Caspian shared as they installed additional locks on the rear exit. He always said that good craftsmanship was about respecting the people who would depend on your work. I never thought that would include keeping zombies out of a community center. Dmitri paused in his hammering, struck by the word choice. Zombies. Is that what we're calling them now? What else would you call something that was dead and walking around trying to eat people? Caspian's attempt at humor fell flat in the face of their grim reality, but it represented an important step in accepting what their world had become. The women had taken charge of organizing their limited supplies and establishing living spaces within the building. Esmeralda's background in logistics from her years managing a small business proved invaluable in creating efficient systems for food distribution and waste management. Isolde's natural nurturing instincts helped establish spaces where the children could feel safe, while Serafina's medical training became crucial when Thaddeus began experiencing chest pains on their second day. It's probably just stress, the old man insisted as Serafina listened to his heart with a stethoscope from her medical kit. I've survived worse than this. But Serafina could hear the irregular rhythm that spoke of a heart pushed beyond its limits. She kept her concerns to herself, knowing that morale was as important as medical care in their current situation. Instead, she quietly adjusted his duties to reduce physical stress while maintaining his important role as the group's tactical advisor. The children had adapted to their new reality with the resilience that only youth could provide. Zara had taken charge of Orion, reading to him from books they had found in the center's small library and creating games that kept his mind occupied. The 17-year-old found purpose in protecting someone even more vulnerable than herself, and her maturity impressed the adults who watched her sacrifice her own childhood to preserve his. Lysander and Evander had appointed themselves as the group's scouts, using their small size and natural agility to move through the building's ventilation system and monitor the infected's movements outside. Their twin connection allowed them to communicate with minimal words, making them perfect for reconnaissance missions that required stealth and coordination. The group near the main gate is getting bigger, Lysander reported during one of their evening meetings. Maybe 40 or 50 now, and they're not wandering off like they did the first day. Evander continued his brother's thought seamlessly, they seem to be learning. Or remembering. Yesterday one of them tried to climb the fence instead of just pushing against it. This intelligence was troubling. If the infected were capable of adaptation, their current defenses might not remain effective for long. The adults exchanged worried glances over the children's heads, each understanding that their temporary sanctuary might be more temporary than they had hoped. It was on the fourth night that they suffered their first real loss. Thaddeus had volunteered for the midnight watch, insisting that his insomnia made him the logical choice for guard duty. Serafina found him in the morning, slumped over in his chair near the main window, his heart having finally succumbed to the stress and exertion of their new reality. The grief that followed was unlike anything the group had experienced. They had lost neighbors and friends to the infection, but those losses felt abstract, removed from their immediate circle. Thaddeus's death was intimate and personal, robbing them not just of a loved one but of their most experienced survivor and tactical advisor. Serafina's composure cracked as she held her father's hand for the last time. "He taught them how to fight," she whispered to Esmeralda, who had become her closest confidant among the adults. "He taught my boys how to survive, and now he's gone." The funeral was a simple affair, held in the community center's main hall with words spoken by each family member. They buried him in the small garden behind the building, marking the grave with a cross fashioned from 2 pieces of wood and the promise that they would continue to protect each other as he had protected them. But Thaddeus's death had done more than rob them of his expertise. It had forced them to confront their own mortality and the possibility that not all of them would survive whatever was coming next. The children looked to the adults with new awareness of their vulnerability, while the adults struggled with the weight of responsibility for lives beyond their own families. That night, as they shared a dinner of canned soup and stale crackers, the survivors made a pact that would define the rest of their time together. They were no longer 3 separate families who happened to be sharing space. They were one family, bound by loss and sustained by love, committed to ensuring that Thaddeus's sacrifice would not be in vain. The infected had been testing their defenses for over a week, and on a gray Tuesday morning, they finally found a weakness. It started with a section of fence near the building's rear corner, where repeated pressure from dozens of bodies had gradually loosened the posts from their concrete foundations. The sound of metal scraping against stone was barely audible over the constant moaning of the creatures outside, but Evander heard it during his morning patrol. "The fence is failing," he reported to the group, his young face serious beyond his years. Section 7, near the storage shed. "Maybe 2 hours before it gives way completely." Dmitri immediately began calculating options, his military training forcing him to consider tactical withdrawals and defensive positions. But as he studied the building's layout, the harsh reality became clear: there was nowhere to run. The infected had surrounded the community center completely, and any attempt to break through their lines would be suicide, especially with children in tow. "We make our stand here," Caspian declared, checking his rifle's ammunition supply. They had perhaps 50 rounds remaining, enough for a brief firefight but hardly sufficient for a prolonged siege. "If we're going out, we go out fighting." Serafina began preparing medical supplies for what she knew would be casualties, while Esmeralda helped the children move to the most secure room in the building, a former storage closet with thick walls and only one entrance. Zara protested being separated from the adults, but Isolde's firm voice brooked no argument. "Your job is to protect Orion," she told the teenager. "If something happens to us, you're his best chance of survival. Can you do that?" Zara nodded solemnly, understanding that she was being entrusted with the most important task of all. As she helped Orion gather his few possessions, including the stuffed elephant that had become his talisman, she felt the weight of adult responsibility settling on her shoulders. Lysander refused to be relegated to the children's room, arguing that he and his brother were experienced fighters who had proven themselves during their escape. The twins had indeed matured rapidly during their time in the center, their natural coordination making them effective team fighters despite their youth. "Grandfather trained us for this," Lysander insisted, clutching the modified baseball bat that had become his weapon of choice. "We're not hiding while our family fights." The argument was settled when the fence finally gave way with a sound like breaking bones. Through the windows, they could see the infected pouring through the gap, their shambling gait becoming purposeful as they detected the warmth and life emanating from the building. There was no more time for debate or preparation, the battle for their lives had begun. Dmitri had positioned himself at the main entrance, using overturned tables and chairs to create a choke point that would force the infected to approach in single file. His engineering background had taught him the importance of controlling enemy movement, and he put that knowledge to work as the first creatures reached the doors. Caspian took the rear entrance, his hunting rifle providing long-range support as infected figures attempted to circle around the building. His carpenter's hands were steady as he sighted down the barrel, each shot carefully placed to maximize effectiveness with their limited ammunition. The twins positioned themselves at the windows, using their agility to move between firing positions and prevent the infected from concentrating their attack on any single point. Their coordination was remarkable to watch. Where one went, the other followed, creating a mobile defense that confused and disrupted the creature's attempts to organize. Serafina and Esmeralda had taken charge of the building's interior, moving between the defenders with medical supplies and ammunition while maintaining communication with the children in their secure room. Isolde stayed near the storage closet, serving as the last line of defense between the infected and the most vulnerable members of their group. The battle raged for hours, waves of infected pressing against their defenses only to be repelled by desperate courage and careful planning. But ammunition was finite, and exhaustion was taking its toll on the defenders. Caspian's shots became less accurate as his hands began to shake from fatigue, while Dmitri found himself relying more on improvised weapons as his rifle ran empty. It was Lysander who made the observation that changed everything. "They're not just attacking randomly," he called out during a brief lull in the fighting. "Look at how they're moving, they're coordinating somehow, learning from each wave." The implications were terrifying. If the infected were capable of tactical thinking, their small group's survival became even more unlikely. But the observation also provided hope. If the creatures were learning, they might also be capable of communication, and communication could potentially be disrupted. Evander, working alongside his brother, noticed something else. The ones in better condition are staying back, letting the more damaged ones attack first. It's like they're preserving their strongest fighters. This intelligence proved crucial when the infected launched what appeared to be their final assault. Instead of the chaotic rush they had experienced all day, the creatures approached with deliberate organization, using their numbers to systematically probe for weaknesses while their strongest members waited for the opportunity to exploit any breach in the defenses. As darkness fell and their ammunition dwindled to the final few rounds, the survivors faced the possibility that they had fought their last battle. But they had also discovered something about their enemy that might prove valuable if they somehow survived the night. The infected were not mindless after all, and that knowledge might be the key to eventual victory or escape. Dawn brought an unexpected silence that was somehow more unnerving than the constant moaning that had filled the previous day. Dmitri crept to the window, his body aching from hours of combat, and peered through a crack in their makeshift barricade. The infected had withdrawn to the perimeter of the property, but they hadn't left. They were waiting, watching, demonstrating a patience that chilled him to the bone. "They're planning something," he reported to the exhausted group. "This isn't random anymore. They're thinking." Serafina had spent the night treating wounds and monitoring everyone's condition. Caspian had taken a bite to his forearm during the final assault, though the thick leather of his work jacket had prevented the teeth from breaking skin. Evander sported a concussion from a fall, while Lysander's hands were cut from handling broken glass. Most concerning was Esmeralda, who had developed a fever overnight that left her weak and disoriented. "It's not the infection," Serafina assured Dmitri as she checked his wife's temperature. "Probably exhaustion and stress, but she needs rest and proper nutrition." "We all do." Their supplies were critically low. The community center's small kitchen had been stocked for day programs, not extended siege conditions. They had perhaps 2 days of food remaining, and their water situation was becoming equally desperate. The infected had somehow damaged the building's main water line, forcing them to rely on emergency supplies that were rapidly dwindling. It was during their morning strategy meeting that they heard something that changed everything, a voice calling from outside, human and clear, speaking words that made their hearts race with impossible hope. "Hello inside. We know you're alive in there. We're from the military evacuation center 15 miles north. We're here to help." Zara was the first to reach the window, her young eyes straining to see through the morning mist. "There," she pointed to a figure near the main gate, dressed in military fatigues and carrying what appeared to be professional radio equipment. "It's real. Help is here." But Lysander, ever cautious, noticed something that made him hesitate. Look at how the infected are behaving around him. They're not attacking, but they're not ignoring him either. It's like they're waiting for something. The military figure continued calling out, providing details about the evacuation center and promising transport for all survivors. His information seemed legitimate: names of government officials, references to military units, even knowledge of other survivor groups that had been successfully evacuated. But something about the situation felt wrong to the more experienced adults. Why would they send one person? Caspian questioned, his carpenter's practical nature making him suspicious of anything that seemed too good to be true. If they have the resources for evacuation, why not send a proper rescue team? Dmitri studied the scene through binoculars they had found in the center's equipment room. The military figure appeared genuine, but there were details that bothered him. The uniform looked correct, but it was too clean for someone who had been operating in a zombie-infested area. The equipment appeared professional, but the way the man carried it suggested unfamiliarity with its operation. We need to test him. Thaddeus had taught them to verify everything before taking action, and his lessons remained valid even after his death. Ask him something only real military would know. When they questioned the figure about specific evacuation protocols and military procedures, his answers came just a beat too slow, as if he were consulting something before responding. More troubling was his increasing insistence that they open the doors immediately, claiming that infected reinforcements were approaching and they had only minutes to escape. It was Serafina who made the connection that saved their lives. As a nurse, she had worked with military medical personnel during disaster relief operations, and she remembered specific protocols that would be second nature to any genuine rescue operative. He doesn't know basic triage procedures, she whispered to the group. When I asked about medical evacuation protocols, he gave me textbook answers, not field experience. Something's very wrong here. Their suspicions were confirmed when Evander, watching from a different window, reported what he saw behind the false rescuer. There are people moving in the woods behind him, but they're moving wrong. Like the infected, but trying to hide it. The terrifying truth became clear: the infected had evolved beyond simple hunger. They were now capable of deception, using human speech and coordinated tactics to lure survivors into the open. The military figure was either an infected who retained enough cognitive function to speak, or worse, a human who was working with the creatures for reasons they couldn't comprehend. We stay put, Dmitri declared, though he could see the disappointment in everyone's faces. The hope of rescue had been intoxicating, and losing it was almost as devastating as the original outbreak. But their refusal to emerge had consequences. The false rescue attempt had been a test, and their failure to respond as expected triggered something in the infected that had been lurking just out of sight. The creatures began moving with new purpose, no longer content to wait at the perimeter. They had learned patience, but they had also learned that their prey was too intelligent to be easily deceived. As the infected began their final approach, using tools and coordinated movements that spoke of rapidly evolving intelligence, the survivors faced a terrible choice. They could remain in the community center and face certain death when their defenses finally failed, or they could attempt to break through enemy lines and reach genuinely safe territory, knowing that such an attempt would likely cost them everything. The decision would determine not just their survival, but their understanding of what humanity meant in a world where the line between living and dead was no longer clear. The plan they conceived in desperation would have been impossible a week earlier, but loss and necessity had transformed ordinary people into something harder, more determined. They would create a diversion that would draw the majority of the infected to one side of the building while the group escaped through the opposite direction. The plan required someone to stay behind and ensure the diversion lasted long enough for the others to reach safety. Caspian volunteered immediately, his decision made before the others could fully process what was being proposed. "I'm the best shot we have left," he said simply, checking his rifle one final time. "In Isolde, you'll make sure Orion remembers me as I was, not as I became." The argument that followed was fierce but brief. They all understood that time was running out, and sentiment was a luxury they could no longer afford. Isolde held her husband for a long moment, memorizing the feel of his embrace and the sound of his heartbeat. Orion clung to his father's leg, too young to fully understand goodbye but old enough to sense its finality. Take care of your mother, Caspian whispered to his son. And remember that being brave doesn't mean not being scared, it means doing what's right even when you are scared. The escape route led through the building's service tunnels, a maintenance system that Dmitri had discovered during their first week. The tunnels were narrow and claustrophobic, forcing them to crawl single-file through spaces barely wide enough for an adult. But they led to a drainage outlet nearly 200 yards from the building, far enough to potentially avoid detection if Caspian's diversion worked as planned. Serafina had insisted on going last, her medical training making her the logical choice to assist anyone who might become injured or trapped during the crawl. Lysander and Evander went first, their small size allowing them to navigate the tunnels quickly and scout for obstacles. Zara followed with Orion, the young boy's stuffed elephant clutched tightly in his arms as she guided him through the darkness. Dmitri came next, then Esmeralda despite her weakened condition, with Isolde close behind her. Serafina brought up the rear, pausing at the tunnel entrance to look back one final time at the community center that had been their home and fortress. Caspian's diversion began with systematic gunfire from the building's upper windows, each shot carefully placed to create maximum noise and confusion. The infected responded exactly as hoped, converging on the building with renewed aggression while the escape party crawled through tunnels filled with decades of dust and debris. The drainage outlet emerged in a wooded area behind a residential development, giving them cover as they made their way toward the evacuation center that might or might not exist. They moved in silence, Orion's occasional whimpers muffled by his mother's gentle reassurances and the overwhelming need for stealth. Behind them, the gunfire continued for nearly 20 minutes before falling silent. No one spoke about what that silence meant, but Isolde's quiet tears spoke volumes about the price of their freedom. They had gained their lives, but they had also learned that survival sometimes required sacrifices that changed the fundamental nature of who they were. The evacuation center, when they finally reached it, proved to be real but not what they had expected. A hastily constructed military checkpoint marked the boundary of a safe zone that extended for perhaps 10 square miles. Beyond its perimeter, the infected roamed freely, but within its borders, something approaching normal life had been restored. The soldiers who processed their arrival were professional but haunted, their eyes carrying the weight of decisions and losses that mirrored the survivors' own experiences. They spoke of other safe zones scattered across the country, connected by radio but isolated by vast expanses of infected territory. The world they had known was gone, replaced by islands of humanity surrounded by an ocean of the walking dead. In the days that followed, the surviving members of their 3 families found themselves assigned to different housing units, their artificial family beginning to dissolve under the bureaucratic necessities of refugee management. But the bonds forged in crisis proved stronger than administrative convenience, and they made sure to gather each evening, sharing meals and memories as they processed their trauma and grief. Zara had matured beyond her years, her experience protecting Orion having awakened protective instincts that would define the rest of her life. The twins, Lysander and Evander, had found purpose in training younger refugees, passing on the survival skills their grandfather had taught them. Isolde struggled with single parenthood while mourning her husband, but found strength in the extended family that had formed around shared loss. Dmitri and Esmeralda worked with the military to improve the safe zone's defenses, their experience during the siege providing valuable insights into infected behavior and tactics. Serafina established a medical clinic, treating both physical injuries and the psychological wounds that all survivors carried. But questions remained that haunted their quiet moments. The infected's evolving intelligence suggested something more complex than a simple plague, and reports from other safe zones indicated that the creatures were continuing to develop new capabilities. The false rescue attempt had demonstrated strategic thinking that went beyond basic predatory instincts. On the 6-month anniversary of their escape, the survivors gathered at a memorial they had erected for Caspian and Thaddeus. 2 simple wooden crosses marked their sacrifice, surrounded by flowers that Orion had picked because Daddy liked pretty things. As they stood together in the evening light, they understood that their survival had been both victory and defeat. They had preserved life at the cost of innocence, gained family through the loss of everything familiar. The world beyond the safe zone remained dangerous and uncertain, but within their small circle, something precious had been preserved. love, loyalty, and the willingness to sacrifice for others had survived when so much else had been lost. In a world transformed by death, they had discovered that humanity's greatest strength lay not in its ability to destroy, but in its capacity to protect, to endure, and to find hope in the darkest of circumstances. Their story was one of thousands being written in safe zones across the country, each a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the power of connection in the face of unimaginable loss. They had become more than survivors, they had become guardians of tomorrow, carrying forward the memory of those lost and the promise of what might still be saved.